So welcome you all for the Nehru Memorial Museum Memorial Lecture by Dr. Sanjay Kumar Rajhans. He is at the moment in the faculty of the Higher School of Economics, Moscow, Russia. As all of you are well aware of it, his topic of lecture would be nation building in post-Soviet Russia, comparing the 90s and the 2000 policies. So without wasting much time, I request Dr. Rajhans to deliver his lecture on this. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor Mahapatra, and the esteemed guest, the audience who are here to deliberate on this topic together. To begin with my discussion of today, I would like to highlight two of the points that this has been the few extremely informative years about Russia for past 5 and 6 years. And it doesn't really matter that which newspaper and which journals you are reading, in which part of the world, Russia has been in the highlight, in the mediated space, so to say. And there has been much of a narrative, much of a discussion that goes about Russia. Most of the time it goes like cut, copy, and paste from the Western media space. And that's why it is quite imperative as of today that we do have a decoupling of those narratives and try to see the story the way it has to be seen. So I would like to discuss my today's presentation on two different spaces. One is about the last years of Soviet Union and the way the legacy, the socio-cultural legacy of Soviet Union persisted in the cultural milieu of the present-day Russian Federation. The difficult years of 1990s and the reconsolidation or reassertion of the Russian state. And besides that, we would like to see that despite the religious and the sociocultural cohesiveness that Russia does have in abundance, there are certain chinks in the armor, there are certain challenges that Russia as a state faces, and the way it has been handling it all. Certain big issues that Russia has confronted in the past 5 or 7 years has created a certain level of shift in their international politics, as much as it has, I would say, further pushed the Russian policymakers to reorient its policy about the identity. One more thing that I would say here, that just a couple of months ago, one of the Russian ideologue and political advisor of the Kremlin, Vladislav Surkov, wrote a fantastic paper where he says about 100 years of solitude. And that is a bit of confrontation about the way the Russian state, the Russian space, and Russian, as they say it, Ruski Mir, has to re-identify and reassert itself and reconsolidate itself. So my discussion would be following on those issues. So Russia was born as a principality, then it became a monarchy, then an empire, then a union of Soviet republics, then a pseudo-democratic plutocracy, and now she is rather a bizarre mix of all the above, trying to impersonate a modern democratic federation with, however, traditional values. That is the kind of a general impression, if at all you want make a kind of, take the liberty of making a generalized remark. That's how it would be seen in one single quick moment. And what is really interesting is that the past 25, 27, 28 years, there have been traditional scholars and authors of Russia who had not been in much circulations in the Soviet Union period, has become again extremely popular, both in the establishment, amongst the scholars. The scholars like Konstantin Leontiev, Ivan Ilyin, Lev Tikhomirov, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose 100 years anniversary is being celebrated all across Russia, and has been one of the favorite authors and thinkers of both the Russian president as well as the present Russian government. So we will try to take a kind of a step back in order to understand those issues which had been coming in the late 1970s and early 1980s when with the demise of Brezhnev and the couple of quick succession of Mr. Chernenko and Andropov, when this period just necessitated the birth of perestroika. And the capitalist perestroika preceded that, and reaching the limits of the state burden on the economy from 1910, when it was 10%, to 1970, it was 50%. The information revolution, the third wave that has swept across in the different parts of the world, and the post-industrialism that took its massive rootings in the Western Hemisphere. Now, you have some of the other issues which are related with the crisis of the big corporations and rise of the network enterprises. And the last point is the emergence of the network society and the crisis of the modern state. Now, before we try to discuss the identity policies or identity politics of Russian state per se, we need to basically see it, what do we mean and what do we understand by the way the citizenship is being understood. So the key questions in the identity politics are like, who am I, who we are, and what do we want to be? So the aspiration and the reality. And do I or we, for that matter, belong to this or that group or community? So if at all we take those minimum points, which concerns about the identity and the self-association, the idea of community or belonging to a certain community, these are the key points. Now, there has been massive research work that has been going on in one of the most leading think tanks of Russia, Institute of World Economy and International Relations, IMEMO as they call it, Institute Mirovая Экономика и Международные отношения. They have written voluminous research work on the subject of identity, and there are a plethora of scholars who have tried to see this, not only in the Russian or Eurasian context, but worldwide. And the study presents identity as a category of social and humanitarian knowledge, which allows to distinct and describe semantic characteristics of individual and collective activities. So it is provided in the context of self-definition of those actors as belonging to different groups and communities who have their clear self-value normative evaluations. Now, before that, we try to see the historical space of Russia, which has been about spread and settlement like any other civilizational platform would be. So you have the periods of spread of Russia, and then you have the periods of settlement of Russia. So you see there have been certain schisms, there are certain cleavages that has taken place on the Stare Verushe, the old believers and the new believers. Then you have the conflict that has taken place during the Napoleonic War. Then you have the great abolition of the serfdom, and then the 1905 to 1922, the period of massive turmoil that results into the demise of Russian Tsarist regime or Russian Tsarist era, sorry to say that, and then the certain stability that continues there for almost 70 years. And 1960 is another period when Khrushchev creates a thaw, and 1985-86. Perestroika and Glasnost. So these are the periods where the boats are shaken up quite a bit. But then there are periods of settlement where we see that the great Tsarina of Russia, Catherine the Great, then you have Nikolai I, Alexander III, and the periods of Stalin's high level of industrialization and making Soviet Union at par with United States. And then you have the second regime of Yeltsin, and then followed by 18 years of Vladimir Putin. So you can define the historical narrative of Russia in these two different characteristics and by these two different features. I would like to quote here Grigory Revzin, who says about the decaying and abandoned legacies of socialism all across Eurasian, or so to say, in particular the Russian space, where the entire Russian landscape dotted with abandoned concrete structures, Soviet machinery, rotting in the fields, with the scars of abandoned roads and glades and decaying houses is nothing but a dumping site of failed attempt at modernization. This might look like a sweeping remark to many of us because the planned economy, the growth of Soviet Union as the leading power of the world, as one of the two superpowers of the world, had its own spring years, and the decadence of certain years of Brezhnev, and then you have this degradations that has followed immediately after that, has created this mono-cities syndrome where thousands of cities which had industrial spots in Russia were left abandoned when denationalization process was started by the Yegor Gader's shock therapy. Now, if at all we talk about what about the Soviet civilization, it is an important chapter in the human history, though a brief one in the chronological order of thousands of years. And we see that one of the greatest sociologists of Russia, Professor Kordonsky, says, our far distant archaeologist descendants are likely to be amazed as they explore the ruined launch silos of Soviet strategic missiles, huge radiation and chemical dumps, and the remains of the other great five-year plan projects. They will be grasping as to which unknown civilization created them and why. So these are the narratives, these are the messages of the despondent years of late 90s, when the great identity of being a Soviet has been abandoned en masse for gaining a new identity of being a Russian. The national identity has yet to be formed, and the old identity has been taken off. So it is a transition period's expression. But there are certain realities. USSR collapsed, but not gone. And there are data that says about it, and it is as late as 2016, the sociological opinion polls of 2016 says the attitude of Russians to the disintegration of the USSR and the revival of the Union. And the strongly regret 2006, 2016, 42% of the people strongly regret that Soviet Union, which used to be a state, or more or less the way the citizens used to think of it as a nation, has ceased to exist. Rather regret, 21%, in 2016 again. Rather not regret, that is a big minority compared to the early years of 1990s. And strongly not regret has been 13%, and difficult to answer, there are undecided people on 14%. So if we talk about the nostalgia of the Soviet Union, which had been questioned and hollered by the scholars of the West as something, as a very authoritarian, repressive regime to its citizens, has been fondly remembered by its citizens today. And at least 50% of today's citizens of Russia has something more positive to think about Soviet Union compared to the negative agenda. So we try to see this in the time frame of policy projects and policy outputs. And there are periods that we would like to see here the way it has been built over a period of time. So here it goes. Viktor Chernomyrdin has said something which has become very epic in Russian space. We tried better but all the time, but it went its usual way. So from 1980 to 2000 has been a period of 20 years of Russian space, which has gone on the pull and push of policy impasse. And we see it in the last years of Brezhnev, which is being known as stagnation in the academic space about Russian studies, those who say about that it's a stagnation era. Then it has been followed by two quick succession of Andropov and Chernenko, and then you have the period of perestroika and glasnost that finally results into the dissolution of Soviet Union 7 years later. So that is the period when we talk about, we see certain tendencies, while Andropov has been trying to reconsolidate the state, kickstart the economy, kickstart the social revitalization of the economic and mediated space. And then you have the opening up of the Russia in 1985 by Gorbachev, in particular Soviet Union, so to be correct, and then you have 1991. And then from 1991 to 2000 years, those years by the common citizens of Russian Federation and the and the other members of the former Soviet Union are being considered as the dark years for those people who had been facing the issues related with regular salary to be delivered, pensions to be provided, and the food shelves are empty, and the crime on the financial market has been on its zenith. So there are a whole set of factors in 1990 that suggests that the period was not the brightest part. So that is one narrative. The other narrative has been that it is those 10 years or 9 years of Russia when it was opened to its most. She was quoting and engaging with the Western alliances, Western powers. It became a member of the Council of Europe. It tried to become, it considered very seriously to be a member of the NATO and other European political and military architecture. And then you have the epoch-making situation that happens in Yugoslavia that basically generates, and I would say rather shocks the Russian scholars, Russian policymakers to generate a new kind of policy planning, to create a new understanding about how they should conduct their both internal and external policy positioning. So if at all we see that, there are certain issues that we will go further down the line to discuss. So what happens there, that in 1991, the whole of Russia and Russian citizens are in euphoria when they think that they have finally earned democracy, earned freedom, and as a default, they would earn prosperity that they were always watching from this side of Europe to their counterparts in the West of consumers' prosperity and the prosperity of the middle class. But in 1991 to 1993, there has been shock therapy that the Russian economy has faced, and there are still academicians who are thinking at length about the way, whether was it necessary prescription for the Russian economy to go that way. But the end result was the hyperinflation resulting into 3 digits and 4 digits. And then the social unrest that shook the very fabric of that honeymoon period between the regime, the Yeltsin's governance, and its subjects. And what happens later, that in 1993, the members of Russian Parliament, Duma, basically tries to reassert its authority, and the Western supported and democratically nominated leadership of Boris Yeltsin starts to bomb its own parliament. And then the rest is a history. Everybody basically is aware of the fact. Then the conflict between the branches of power goes very high. The vice president's post is being abolished. And what happens are the pictorial. So one picture says thousands of words, so I won't really repeat that. So here comes the idea of the citizenship. The citizenship which basically identifies and brackets more or less the idea of identity too. So the preamble says, "We, the multinational people of the Russian Federation, united by a common fate of our land, establishing human rights and freedoms, civic peace and harmony, reviving the sovereign statehood of Russia and asserting the firmness of its democratic basis, striving to ensure the well-being and prosperity of Russia, proceeding from the responsibility for our motherland before the present and future generations, recognizing ourselves as part of the world community, adopting the Constitution of Russian Federation." So at the very beginning, Russia does recognize, acknowledge the multi-ethnicity of its citizens. Now, these are the detailed informations about the laws that they passed over a period of time, starting from December 12, 1993. So you have civil code and media law, trade union law, public associations law, and not-for-profit organizations. So a whole sort of things that basically strengthens and empowers and consolidates the rights of the citizens in their country has been adopted. Now, before we go further down the line, we need to see the way the public sphere and the public space is being mediated by both institutionalized and non-institutionalized actors. So we see that in the main public sphere, you have the widespread state television channels and radios and some political print media. And then you have a parallel public sphere, which is basically the mediated discourse that happens. On the institutionalized level, you have those television channels or radio stations which are led or coordinated or controlled by the state or the state-friendly organizations. But then on the other side, the parallel or non-institutionalized organizations, you have blogs, social networks, the discourse that cannot be managed by the state. So even today, while there is a discourse and the general narrative that goes on that the state is very authoritarian, I would like to share with you a very interesting phenomena that one of the most critical radio station of Russia called Echo Moskwy is basically supported and sponsored by the Gazprom media, that is basically a state-run organization. And despite its scathing criticism and attack on the Russian state, or so to say the Russian government, they are never being persecuted, and the journalists are not being, silenced through gagging laws. So that is the kind of fact that is less told in the Western generated, Western mediated, Western coordinated international news agencies, that there are certain institutions that are not parroting the narrative of the state, but are criticizing, examining, and bringing the state to the task, and yet at the same time they are supported by the same state. Now we go to those first president of Russia who wanted to see Russia as a democratic, free society, and he prepared the situation, which is, we call it construction and deconstruction, and construction and destruction path of Russian history that has happened over the centuries. So you have this revolutionary destruction of the structure of the Soviet modernity as Yeltsin's path to power, anti-communist revolution, and mixed results of Yeltsin's revolution is an electoral democracy, yet an illiberal polity, at least in the past 20 years, a capitalist economy, yet it is crony capitalism led primarily by the oligarchs, a decentralized but unsustainable federation. So in the 1990s, the president of Russia did say to its subjects, to its different states, oblast as they call, that you can take as much sovereignty as you can digest, as you can manage with. So decentralization was the theme in both the first 2 years of the second term of Boris Yeltsin. Late 1990s, there is already a reform fatigue, both amongst the electorates and the regime, the administration, and they really want to bring a certain level of stability, a certain level of semblance, the way the statehood has to assert. Now, we see that in 1995 to 2000, we see certain institutions built up and Russia's engagement with the West. Russian Federation is joining Council of Europe, partnership agreement with European Union, cooperation with USA, joining G7 that becomes later on G8. So you have the formation of the new legal order, ratifications of the laws of Council of Europe is being adopted by the Russian state. That includes the inclusion of the European Court of Human Rights legal positions and the national system of legislation and law enforcement. So we are witnessing the birth of a new Russia that is not Tsarist Russia, that is not Soviet Unionized Russia, a Russia that has been trying its best to lockstep its advancement in the westernized world. But then there is another narrative which has been overwhelming, which has been far closer to the truths and realities of the common mass, which comprises the overwhelming majority of any state, the negative experience of the 1990s. During the troublesome 1990s, Russia briefly became a taste of postmodernism, but it quickly rejected it because of the bitter experience of 1990. Western liberalism is associated with Russia with certain words called poverty, civil war, corruption, debauchery, lawlessness, and national humiliation. So what we see here is, as of today, I mean, you just hop across 20 years down the line and you see a new Russia who it is having the convergence of real politics, patriotism, conservatism, and reassertion of the state. So we see that Putin is a real politic. At the same time, he promotes Russian social and religious philosophy, spoken and written and articulated by scholars like Dostoevsky, Ilyin, Berdayev, and Solovyev. Then there is also a gradual convergence between the neoclassical Eurasianism and pragmatic Eurasianism in the process of Eurasian economic integration. So what we try to see that when we talk in the conceptual framework of identity politics, so as much as Russia has been asserting or redefining its external identity projection, it has been updating, inculcating, enriching its internal identity elemental characteristics. So these are two parallel development that is taking place in the early years of this new millennium. So if we see the period of Yeltsin, just to have a recap, he suggested the early adoption of the new Constitution of India, Russian Federation, and that would consolidate democratic transformation, clarity, division of powers that would allow the liberal economic reforms. But then, if we talk about the Russian and Soviet Constitution, all the powers belong to Supreme Soviet. But in 1993, all powers starts to get consolidated and concentrated to the presidency. Yeltsin's opponents tried to start impeachment proceedings against him, but they did not get the required number of votes, as I showed you through the bombings and bombardment to the Russian Duma. But then, on the other side, so as much as the authoritarian tendencies are there in order to control and rule the state inside, there is an external projection of Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia, that it has been quoting, engaging, and integrating with the institutions of European Union. So that is what you see, those landmark dates and chronological achievements that in 1998, Russia ratifies the European Convention on Human Rights. 1999, by the end of the year, ECHR received 1,787 individual complaints of Russian citizens where they filed the complaints to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg that their basic rights are violated. And then Russian state became tolerant and patient to allow those redressal mechanisms to apply in the Russian Federation's jurisdiction. Then you see in 2001, more than 5,000 civil society leaders and activists gathered in the Kremlin at the Civil Forum with the participation of President Putin, members, and the members of the Russian government. So what we are trying to see, Russia has taken a definitive break from the totalitarian, authoritarian, one-party political system where the dissent is crushed or gagged. And that has been happening in the very first years of 2001. But then there are certain lessons to be learned about the transition, and there are three lessons of transition, at least in the subject of statehood and stateless. Stated goals at times are different from the inner logic of the transition. The privatization of transition and of democratic procedures are done most of the time by the elites. And key role of the state is from the narrative of democratic consolidation to the narrative of state building. So there is an implicit understanding of the goals, and there is an explicit narrative about it which doesn't really coincide and are not mutually inclusive. So we see here the stated goals versus inner logic. So 1980s, power is in the Soviet system. That's how the narrative is. But then, on the real side, we see the authoritarianism has its roots. In 1990, we talk about the transition period and privatization, and at the same time, you have electoral democracy, and on the economic sphere, we see the usurpation of the economic assets of the Russia by certain families and oligarchs. In 2000, power in the post-Soviet system. Then, is it back to the future? Or is it the dawn of the illiberal democracy, populist democracy, charismatic democracy by a leader which has authority? So that has to be seen again in the conceptual framework of Culture 1 and Culture 2. Through the Russian space has two parallel social culture, political culture that coincides and flows together in the time period of 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century. So the abolishing of the past, looking into the future, futurist and technocratic improvisation and innovation. So that is forward-looking culture, but at the same time Culture 2, which is about eternity, preservation, which is existing. Lenin's tomb is still there, the mausoleum still exists. The end of history, and Fukuyama's narrative is basically being discarded now the world over. But Russia took the initiative of debunking Fukuyama's discourse. I guess most notably and most quoted one of those events are 2007's Munich Security Conference, where President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, does say that the hegemonic unipolar world has to take a pause. And then you have the another idea when you talk about the culture of fire, Raskolniki, self-immolation, cremation. I would not really take much of a time on that because then it goes on the cultural anthropology of the Russian space. But I'll come back to that if at all there are questions and discussions on that. So here comes the issue which has been much discussed and criticized in the liberal media or mediated space, so to say, the reassertion of the conservative or traditional social cultural values, and that basically creates or I would say builds a new identity of the Russian citizens. That how they are inspired, how they are basically identify themselves as, where they are trying to reclaim, regain the Orthodox Christianity as their cultural and religious social space too. In accordance with the Constitution of Russia, the church is separated from the state and the state from the church. But you see that this is a learning space where the press are being invited to talk to the citizens. And what scholars are noticing is that the re-traditionalization is not limited simply to private spiritual renewal or communal religious revival. So this is a subject that we would like to kind of deliberate on. Re-traditionalization often involves a reconfiguration of the totality of the society, which of course involves the political and cultural, educational norms of a population around pre-modern religious beliefs and practices. And this re-traditionalization cannot be termed that it's a Russia alone factor. We can see it because of the migrant crisis that has swept across the whole continental Europe, in particular the European Union, and the way certain populist leadership has emerged as a response to that, either in Germany, Hungary, Greece, Italy, you name it, and the way they are trying not to let their states become swamped, so to say, by the migrants. And the multiculturalism, multiculti, is not such a taken for granted word in the cultural space of Europe. So perhaps there is no better example of re-traditionalization anywhere in the world right now than what's going on in Russia, particularly involving the revitalization of the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, we have to remember, is it something that is a new development in the Russian space, or it is reclaiming or regaining the vitality of the Russian identity that used to exist prior to 1917 Bolshevik Revolution? And we have the data in the Russian archives that says that prior to the 1917 October Revolution, there were more than 50,000 churches, 2,500 chapels, there were 1,000 monasteries, 60 seminaries, 4 theological academies. So the church was practically decimated and devastated in those 70 years. But since 1991, the Russian Orthodox Church has experienced nothing but then a resurrection in the true terms. So we can see that the 70 years of secular winter after the Soviet Union's disintegration, has brought a theological, religious, traditional spring in the Russian space, so to say. It is as if they were entombed for a perpetual Sabbath, only to be reborn in a springtide of renewed Christianity throughout Eurasia. Now, the most comprehensive study in all this has been a study that was published by the Journal of the Scientific Study of Religion that examined the question as to whether Russia really was experiencing a genuine religious revival. Now, if we say in the true terms, we see at least 3 churches or at least 3 spaces of Orthodox Christianity, prayer places, are being constructed, reconstructed, regained, or revived in one part or the other of Russian Federation. In terms of age and educational levels, for example, the study found that the Russians most likely to identify themselves as Orthodox Christians, and those people from the demographic slab, we see most of them are younger generations, and they actually represented all levels and cutting across the spectrum of their educational exposure or educational expertise. Now, one indicator is the building projects, or better, the rebuilding projects of churches throughout Russia. And Russia was seeing a growth in Christian identity and commitment among the youth and highly educated. They found that their moral commitments of Russians, they were thoroughly in step with the Christian ethical norms. Now, if we talk about the Russian Federation today, we see a certain level of cleavage, though it is a minor one, but it's nevertheless existing. You have open cleavages between the social status. There are different identities and conflicting interests of different publics that have recently grouped into 2 parties, Europhiles and Eurasianists. So you have this patriotic public and democratic public, so to say, the way they are kind of identifying themselves inside the Russian political arena. They are those who are patriotic public consider themselves closer and in conformity with the state officials. The oligarchs are also participating in big numbers as patriotic citizens of their country, though it is quite questionable of their patriotism, of the way they served their country in a very dubious way in 1990s. And then the Orthodox Church, which is an integral part of the Russian state building. On the democratic public, you see the minority liberal democratic parties that has their popular mandate of less than 1%. Then the civil society, which is very much thriving even today, though most of the civil society members or the institutions that were funded from outside of Russia, they are facing difficult times because of the strict laws on the foreign agent law that has been started with the third term of President Putin. And then human rights activists who have been keeping a close watch on any kind of excesses or violations that has been done by the state bodies. So we can see here there can be different narratives, there can be different modeling that has been discussed by the scholars, that what kind of an authoritarianism that the Russian state or the Russian government has been trying to copy or has been trying to emulate. So we talk about whether Putin is a Pinochet. That's the kind of a question that comes by some of the scholars. Sergei Ivanov has the idea that whether we should follow and emulate who has been now in a more of a political hibernation, but used to be the chief of the presidential administration of Russia in the first 2 terms. And then Vladislav Surkov, the Kremlin ideologue and widely termed the great cardinal of Russia, has been talking about whether we should go for the modernization of Russia through the Japanese model. So the state control of the economy in the South Korean model, and the former president South Korea's Park's dictatorship, and the corporate state, a modernizing dictatorship, one-party rule, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, and the Revolutionary Party of Institutional Revolutionary Party in Mexico, for that matter. If we see Yeltsin's approach in 1990, and why I'm going back and forth, the reason is that these 2 tendencies are coexisting together in present-day Russia of 2019. So we cannot say that one chapter is over and the other chapter has started afresh. The only thing is that there is a dominant tendency, which we call the culture one or culture two, and then there is the preceding culture that goes in the back foot. But these two things are knitting together in order to create a new Russian state. So you have that, some of those achievements of the President Putin's first term, which is the comeback or the revival of the state, attempts at creating a developmental state, imperatives of globalization. So the state doesn't really become monopolistic in the production and economic management, but then the state starts to monitor and coordinate the social and the governance space, and tries to control the excesses of the oligarchs in the economic sphere. So we try to see that the way the scholars and the thinkers have been trying to understand Putin through different analogues, whether he is Mahathir Mohamad, or is he the Deng Xiaoping of Russia, whether he is the Bill Clinton who has been preparing the new kind of political and economic rule, and so to say, and lastly, in past 6 years or so, he's the president of hope, the one who is basically a unifying factor in the Russian political space, in the Russian identity space, where the Russians find a common language with his narration, his narrative, and his idea of the way the state of Russia should be. Now, if we see it through the conceptual framework of the political sociology, we will witness the Russian space in the way the Russians are engaging themselves with their government. So Russian historians of the 19th century, Solovyev and Kluchevsky, are having explained two different trends. One is the habit of the spreader in the population, and the government's desire to catch and attach. And they are the two things that are, again, the key features of Russia's two European and Eurasian tendencies knitting together the Russian state together. So again, coming on the subject of the culture one and culture two, we see here culture one is fighting inequality, the abolishment of the serfdom, equal sharing of space, village land, apartments, egalitarian, equalitarian political system that takes care of the last man on the economic pyramid. No hierarchy of places and people, no rank and exams in schools. So there were a certain period of time where the hierarchy has been looked down upon and has been vigorously resisted. But then you have cultural two that coexist together with culture one, that is the hierarchy of places. Concrete structures of Moscow and of the entire Russian space, if you talk it from the urban studies perspective, the hierarchy of people, the ranks, degrees and uniforms, so what is your dolzhnost is very important. Hierarchical etiquette, list of literature, rules of applause. So the way you are engaging and articulating your ideas amongst mediated space varies. So there is culture one and culture two that coexist together. So there is not a complete departure from one and the other. So they are knitting together the Russian cultural and political space. So you can see that here with the three different pictures, and that says a lot. You have the leadership of Bolshevik Revolution that is being eulogized, has been appreciated and worshipped. And then you have the Russian Orthodox Church that has been basically coexisting silently in margins during the Stalin's period of the Second World War, which is being termed as the Great Patriotic War in Russia, and then it takes a complete total bloom in the modern Russia. So if we see here the rise of culture two, the redistribution of property that happens in 94-96, emergence of the new capitalist class, increasing quest for stability, early attempts at consolidation, then this is culture two that is hierarchical, that says the same democratic, Western-approved, Western worlds applauded Yeltsin bombards the parliament. The war in Chechnya happens. And then the Yeltsin's re-election that has been a complete electoral fraud, but then the West turns the other side not to acknowledge the massive electoral irregularities that has taken place in 1996. Now, you see that the coming back of space. So if we see that the comeback of space that has happened in different periods of time in Russian cultural and political horizon, one is that releasing of the space abroad, so the near abroad are the places which is called the place of political and strategic influence, has been loosened up by Moscow or for that matter Russia. So you see that the departure of Russian or Soviet army from Afghanistan, then the dismantling of Warsaw Pact, withdrawal from the areas of strategic contestation, which is Middle East and the Balkans. But we see again Russia has been reasserting in the Middle East. So you see here the comeback of space culture 1, culture 2 has been existing and living in parallel. So it happens that one of the two elements takes a lead. Then over a period of time, you see that the other element takes the front and the preceding one takes a back seat. So these two cultural space, culture 1 and culture 2, has been coexisting, hierarchical and linear, hierarchical and egalitarian social culture has been existing even during the time of the Tsar's Russia, in the Soviet Union, and in the modern Russia for that matter. So the new vertical that we see here that has been of great importance to many of you who are Russia watchers and experts on Russia, the way the new arrivals and the new verticals has taken place. The foreign policy vertical that has flirted for first 8-9 years about joining the Western alliance and the Western group has summarily abandoned that idea and decided to create its own niche in the geopolitical territory. So you have, starting with abandoning the idea of joining the EU and NATO, disillusionment in cooperation with the West, war on terrorism, return of great power politics that has been happening both in Africa, Latin America, Middle East, opposing the orange revolutions or the color revolution, so to say, Russia as a leader of counter-revolutions and protector of ancient regime. So Russia is one who is a stabilizer, survives and supports their long-term held allies and doesn't ditch them. That is the narrative that has taken massive traction by the other states, both in the Middle East as well as in Africa, as you can witness and observe with the proliferation of the new allies that Russia has been gaining. And then the architectural vertical has been perfected. Now, the same thing that you see here can be explained by the other example, which is called A Tale of Two Temples. And that this is again a question which is related with the way the identity space has been morphed. Two different identity narrative has been morphed into one. So in 1881, you have the construction of the Church of Christ the Savior. In 1931, in Soviet Union, a stabilized period of time, that cathedral has been destroyed, gets demolished. And in 1930s and 40s, there have been massive attempts to build the palace of the Soviets there. And there was a fantastic idea, and they are a part of the recorded history of the Soviet Union, that they had an idea that they would build one of the biggest statues of Lenin in the plan, and the head of the Lenin would be the library. And there would be a hand stretching out where there would be a helipad. But then just because the Second World War intervened those grandiose ideas and all the construction and metallic production basically got diverted into the military-industrial projects rather than to further glorify the first leader of the Soviet Union. Then you see that the demolition of that foundation that was planned by the preceding leadership, Stalin, is basically made as a common people's swimming pool, okay? That is called Pool Moskva. And then in late 1990s, that swimming pool is again being demolished to recreate the Church of Christ the Savior. So the history takes its full circle from 1881 to 1990s, where Christ the Savior Church, the most symbolic, one of the most symbolic churches of Russia, goes through massive demolition, complete demolition, and gets resurrected all over again. Quite symbolic. Now, there's a problem. There's a problematic which is related with the binary culture, a vicious circle of construction and deconstruction. So if at all we see it in the epistemological understanding, we would be facing this puzzle that are we analyzing the history of Russia's identity formation through the lens of construction and deconstruction, or is it something beyond that? Some of the scholars have created a bit of a very sweeping remark, and Yuri Lotman, one of those, has said Russia is a binary culture. Russia's modernizations have entailed a catastrophe, and those catastrophes are basically seen by one of those sweeping generalized narrative that the great leaders of Russia created unrealistic demands to their citizens, and they are, counting Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny, Peter the Great, Lenin, Stalin, Gorbachev. So they say that any kind of a leap of progress in Russian space has resulted into massive devastation and destruction to those very people for whom those plans were conceived at the first place. And the another sweeping remark is that Russian history is caught between anarchy and authoritarianism, between destroying by force and binding by force, between ignorance and injustice. So this is, in short, we can see that this is the narrative of 123 years, 115 years plus. So that is how it happened, and the church has been resurrected. Culture 1, culture 2. And the people of Russia who are observing and identifying themselves with those big iconic symbols are also updating and adjusting their internal as well as their external identity. So if at all we talk in the very formal and constitutional framework, we say that Russia has decided that Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Judaism are the traditional religions of Russia, which plays a central role in the traditional national spirituality. But at the same time, there still remains a formal separation of religion and state, and the Russian constitution even bans the adoption of some kind of official state ideology. The constitution also proclaims the freedom of religion. How do you combine such apparently completely contradictory laws is something that is maneuvering as an acrobat of the leadership of present-day Russia. So you see that if we talk in the very basic cultural and historical origins platform, Russia has those 4 cultural and historical origins and the elemental identity. From the north, you have Russian North Rus. Then you have southern part, which has the Byzantium culture, and the third one, which is you call Eastern, which is Golden Horde with the Mongols period, and from the west, again, it's Europe's engagement with Sweden, engagement with the Nordic countries. To conclude with, I would say here that there has been a perennial didactic that is existing even today, that Russia is Western world, or is it the most dominant constituent of Eurasia that defines Eurasia. So one of the narratives that has been in currency for past 5 years and more is that Russia is Eurasia, and Eurasia is a common space. And there are following regions for that. You have geographical, ethnocultural, and historical. It is polyethnic states, which has more than 194 officially recognized peoples, but then 81% of them are ethnic Russians. Tatars are the second minority, which is 4%, Ukrainians 1.4%, Bashkirs 1.2%, Chuvash 1%, and Chechens 1%. Any attempt to transform Russia into a mono-national state would lead to the death of Russia and to a civil war of unprecedented proportion. That is what, that there has been a debate and discussion that always is being used, that the two words that is explained, Ruski and Rossiyski, that defines about the Russian identity at the same time. And one of the other things that Russophiles and Russian scholars are acknowledging, that Russia is the last Europe. Russia is not an underdeveloped part of Western Europe, because Westernization is a flawed theory. Russia, like the whole of Eurasia, indeed has a European origin, but it is Byzantine in its nature. Western Europe is the heir of Western Rome. Russia is the heir of Third Rome. Because of moral decline, the way the conservative scholars and thinkers are talking about, cultural Marxism, postmodernism, Americanization, mass immigration, Western Europe increasingly ceases to be the Europe of 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. Yet Russia, thanks to the preservation of its cultural and historical identity and in a major way reclaiming those, including its European one, against the background of decadent Europe, is becoming more of an European space than the European space itself. The same is true for some of the Eastern Europe, which has seen the upsurge of the populist political movement, the leadership which has refused to dance to the tunes of the Atlantist. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rajhans. I think your lecture was on the nation building in post-Soviet Russia, but he has effectively dealt with a variety of issues facing the post-Soviet Russia, and he has touched upon all these the different characters, nature. I think he has presented overview of Russia itself, contemporary Russia. I don't think he has left out anything, right, from the post-Soviet history to post-Soviet the Russian history, the post-Soviet polity, post-Soviet economy, and the Russian foreign policy, and the different narratives going on, the kind of hegemonic discourse and the counter-hegemonic discourse. And he has also explained different coinage of the term, terminologies, and the phrases to designate and describe the Russians as such, and the challenges facing them. And now the floor is open for the question answer and the comments you have. And I think you'd be glad to address to your questions or the comments you have, please. GDP.
Thanks a lot. I believe that the last data, if you talk about the way the Russian state has come up with the data that says 1.8 to 1.9, and they are again subject to certain adjustments, 2018, close to 2% of the GDP growth that Russia has gained for the second time in the past 2 years. Russian economy has been on the growth. Yeah. I don't think that I'm quite qualified to speak about it, but I guess the history of Russia's, India's relationship speaks volumes about it. It has been one of the most robust and time-tested relationship that India has. And as the present Prime Minister of India says, that anywhere in the village, if you ask who is your most trusted partner, and the most of those people who have nothing to do with the international politics, diplomacy, and all, they can very easily say that Russia is their most trusted partner abroad. Sure.
So, can you tell us something about the middle management of Russia? That's basically from the economical point of view. And while we talk of politics in Russia, again, you say that it is one party based, and anybody who is starting to dwell on the other parties. So you mean to say it's a monolith party? The Duma has no other opposition leaders. So is there bar or some sort of, It is just like Chinese Communist Party, or what sort of name you would like to suggest to give to Putin's, party in itself, or is it one party, or is it spread over and somebody wants to fight an election with him, so he's not there, or the middle management is also not there. That becomes the, as we call it, people who come and can change over. When we call middle income, the people who can, have their independence thought. So what sort of gamut of, you place it as a complete sovereign state, or you completely, what sort of name you would suggest so that we can understand the entire gamut of the philosophy of politics of Russia?
I would just start with your last question, the sovereignty of the state. I would say that in the present day of the global economic and political system, very few states can have this privilege to say that they have relatively absolute sovereignty over its territorial and demographic space. And Russia is one of those few states on this planet. So they are absolute sovereign in their political choices, both internally and externally. And the choices that they have made both in the issues related with Middle East and its choice of partners, its engagement both in the Latin America and in Africa, as well as its standing by to its partners, most notably, as you can see it in the case of Iran, which is a very vivid example that Russia has the necessary bones at the political decision-making space where they don't have to bend at the whims and fancies of any particular hegemon. Yeah, so I'll come back to that. No, you asked, there are three questions that you said about. So I started from the sovereignty. The second question which you talked about is the middle management. The middle management of Russian state doesn't have the very Britishers adopted civil services structure, that steel frame of bureaucracy that Indians had, the privilege or the misfortune of having one. So they have improvised it with certain other initiatives. Most notably, they have started, of course, one of the institutions that they have is called Russian Academy of National Economy and RANEPA, as they call it. And they are creating very trained bureaucrats who are basically absorbed in different sectors of Russian economy. But besides that, they have thought out of the box, and they have created a campaign which is called Leader Russia, in which the people who are educated, empowered, skilled, and ambitious can apply for a competition which is a bit more of an educational and academic and competitive fair rather than a rigorous civil services exam. But these are the people who are coming from different walks of life, a different level of experience. And then after a grueling test, which is psychological, intellectual, educational, and et cetera, they are being selected as winners, which is a huge number of people, and they are being adopted as the deputy minister. In the case of energy, the guy who last year was chosen as the deputy minister of energy was coming from this Leader Russia contestation. That says the ladder of social ladder has been in operation. The first question that you said about whether it's a one-party system, sir, I'm ready to disappoint you. It's not a one-party system. Russian Duma has four factions which have their representation. Besides United Russia, you have Communist Party of Russian Federation, KPRF. Then you have Just Russia, and then you have Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, one of the oldest serving political party. Unlike the interrupting, disrupting oppositions that we see in some of the very robust democracy, we see that the different political parties, for the sake of the policy formation, policy implementation, and policy feedback, they are coordinating, as we do witness in the parliamentary subcommittee in our Indian Parliament. So that's where you have the factions, and the last governor elections that happened in September 2018, many oblasts had oppositions winning the elections, including in Vladimir, if I'm not mistaken, where a Communist Party leader won the elections, and LDPR got a couple of governor seats. And in the State Council of Russian state, all the opposition parties are the regular invited members. So they are the full members of that, which basically deliberates on the policy formation, policy implementation, and policy feedback. So if we talk about on the policy side of the Russian state, it is not led by one single party, unlike the Communist Party of Soviet Union in the 73 years of authoritarian regime. Yes.
Anybody else?
Excuse me, sir. I would like to ask, in present Indian context, in India, while a statue of Lenin were demolishing in Tripura and West Bengal, there is a conflict of ideology in India and Russia. As an expert, what would you like to suggest? Either India should be on this side or that side, means either in capitalist side or in socialist side.
I am too naive and too unqualified to suggest something that grandiose. What I would just observe here is that destructing or demolishing any monument is not a solution, at least on the policy level. Okay? So you can keep demolishing any statue, but it doesn't really bring anything, because the historical platforms are the reality of the past, which you cannot obliterate. And so far as the positive side of any ideology, communism included, has a certain egalitarian, emancipatory narrative which has been co-opted, perfected, and adopted by the other political spectrums of different political parties. So I do believe that the certain ideas and ideologies that were accepted by the post-independent India in 60s, 70s, and 80s did create a certain kind of a check on the uncontrolled capitalization and loot of the economy, in particular those economies which had already been emasculated by the colonial rule of the past. So I do believe that there is a certain level of qualitative merit in different political spectrums narrative, and a good state and a mature state has to do the cherry picking on those good positive narratives. And I believe that Indian policymakers are wise and mature to do that. Good afternoon.
I think I'm audible. I don't need a mic.
We
Sure.
already had yours. We also want to.
You can use that one, which is just next to you.
Okay.
You can use this.
So I'm a student of second year BA Political Science Honours from Delhi University. So I wanted to ask you, based on whatever I could hear, I had my class. So you said that Russia is preserving its identity. But we have also witnessed, and we are all aware, that its past is not a very glamorous past. It is rife with an authoritarian past. So, and attempts at wiping out a particular certain community which was perceived as a minority. So, this preservation of its identity seems not of its holistic identity, but of an identity of the victors or the groups who were victorious during its violent past. So, sometimes it feels that the identity of Russia is not the identity of Russia itself, but the identity of its majority. Is it true that Russian identity is based on majoritarianism?
I would rather avoid to have such a sweeping generalization because of two reasons. First, let's first of all face the facts. Ministry of Interior Affairs in any country is one of the most sensitive posts, okay? And till 2012, that post was led by one gentleman called Mr. Rashid Nurguliev, who was an ethnic Tatar, okay? The second thing is, one of the biggest mosques in Europe, if not the biggest mosque, is existing in Europe, not in European Union, but in Russia, okay? Russia has fantastic level of autonomy and self-rule to its Muslim-dominated or Muslim-majority subjects or republics, including Ingushetia, Chechnya, and Kabardino-Balkaria, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, etc., etc. And the similar level of privilege and autonomy has been given to the Buddhist majority states. Now, when you talk about preserving the identity of the past, which is not glorious, may I take the liberty of differing with you somewhat that I have a very strong capital lettered caveat to that. And the reason is that on the onslaught of fascism and the Nazist Germany, which was obliterating every ethnic community in the center of Europe, the gas concentration camps became a reality. It was the millions of Russian sacrifice that preserved and restored the true idea of humanity. So celebrating that idea of the past is not the sole work of, I believe, only to the Russian citizens. I think it should be the the common celebration of every members of the humanity. So that glorification or preservation or narration of the past of the mid-20th century when our ancestors or our forefathers faced existential crisis and Russia stood as a bulwark against intolerance, fascism, that is unmatched contribution. And glorification of that unmatched contribution is somewhat keeping us alert and alive for the dangers that may creep up anywhere, at any place in the world. So I do believe that we should basically avoid that binary understanding of any country, in particular as big and as vast and as diverse country as Russia has been. Yeah.
Yeah.
While we were studying in very, maybe primary or secondary schools, we came across Lenin and Stalin. So they were very much in vogue at that time. Now, Lenin was popular amongst the East European state and Stalin in the home itself. Can you shed some light so that we can, as a normal person, we can understand? Because one is a guru and the other is a disciple, and the disciple is more known. What sort of, equation you give to both the peoples, both the leaders?
Well, that has been a very, very difficult question for anybody, I would say that, in particular, even those who are Russophiles. But I won't really go into that terms of a guru and a disciple, because Lenin had not only Stalin as the chosen disciple, first of all. And a person as colossal and as controversial as Stalin has been, we have our own Stalins in India, both figurative as well as the real ones. So I would say the contribution that industrialization of Soviet Union witnessed during that period of time, Stalin is credited with that. Rightly or wrongly, that can be a discussion point. And then the Golodomor, the way some of the people are kind of coining this word, was not related or restricted to one ethnic community. The collectivization had its unintended, unplanned catastrophe. Nobody planned to have a certain section of Soviet Union to be massacred. This was poor planning, executed much poorly. There has been a book by Robert Conquest, the guy who was celebrated in the West, and he wrote a book which has been much in circulation by the Western scholars on Russia that is called The Harvest of Sorrow. And the Western media basically, flagged that out everywhere and kind of distributed it as a free copies to those who were Russia watchers. But then again, it's a sweeping remark, because the same famine took place in Kazakhstan, in Russian proper, in Ukraine, in Belarus, and people died. Irrespective of which territory the farmers and the peasants were basically mistreated or excessively exploited by the Communist Party officials. Now, if we say about that, okay, in Russia, Lenin has been celebrated. He is a historical figure, no doubt, and everybody has a certain level of grudging idea of appreciation because of this epoch-making event that he led, initiated, and brought modernization. We are witnessing electrification in our own country, which has been going on in an unprecedented scale in India. He brought electrification at that time, and ligbez, that was the word that liquidates bez gramotность. Please correct me, my Russian friends. So those two things which were related with the illiteracy has to be removed, modernization has to be brought forward. Those were certain contribution to the demography of Russia, and they are lasting contribution. Similarly, the defeat of fascism has been a lasting contribution of the leadership of the Soviet Union at the time, and as by default, Stalin was at the helm of the affairs, he has been credited with that. And having said that, if you talk about the present-day dispensation of Russian leadership, they are very open and unapologetic about the excesses that has been made by the Stalin's era. And President of Russia, Vladimir Putin's opening up, unveiling of the wall of sorrow that was erected commemorating the hundreds of thousands of people who were persecuted in Gulag is a great testimony of that. And the great book that was written by Solzhenitsyn, The Gulag Archipelago, the great writer whose birth centenary is being celebrated both in Russia and internationally, he was politically much not only restored, but was being seen as a preeminent thinker of a new Russia. So if we see, as I tried my best to kind of decipher the two parallel understanding, one is Byzantium, another is progressive, they are knitting the fabric of Russian identity together, and it is not a new thing. It has been existing from the time of Catherine the Great, and prior to that from Ivan the Terrible. And then you have the advancement at the time of Peter the Great. Then you have certain regressive policies by Alexander II, then again Alexander III. So there has been this you see, the tide and ebb of culture one and culture two that has been coadjusting, updating itself.
Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Rajhans. I have few queries, actually. I just take 2 minutes. What I could understand from your 1 hour presentation on nation-building process in post-Soviet Russia is, I think basically he tried to sum up the different trends and tendencies last 25 years in post-Soviet Russia under 2 cultural spaces. What he says, culture 1 and culture 2. But apparently he has not given, I think intentionally has avoided giving a sweeping conclusion as some of us expected from him. He tried to actually, what I call balance between different argument narratives going on inside Russia, among the Russian scholars, and outside in West. But he has definitely avoided a kind of sweeping conclusion, but that's my academic problem here. You have highlighted all these tendencies, trends, debates, discourse, everything. But you have not very concretely and categorically stated what is the dominant trend, tendency of late, which has had the precedence over others between the two cultures. And to what extent it is contributed to stepping up of the new national identity of post-Soviet Russia. Could it be attributed to the religious revivalism, what you say, revitalization of the Orthodox Church? Or is it attributed to historical experience of Russia, the Byzantium culture? Or it could be attributed to, say, the ethnicity, particularly Slavic ethnicity, because nothing is fixed. What happened during Catherine the Great periods, much water has flown. So you can't say the context has not changed. The context has changed dramatically. When the context changes, international context changes, it does have an impact on the domestic, political, and cultural dynamics. It is simply impossible to escape. At a given point of time, when rightly my friend said, communism since it had the emancipatory message, it had a tremendous appeal, particularly in the countries where the people are struggling for liberation, decolonization, when the countries where the people actually had a different feudal structure. So it definitely did have a relevance, no doubt about it. But 70 years later, I don't think it holds that kind of relevance because the entire context has changed. From, say, the state-owned economy, what we call the state capitalism, we moved to a kind of capitalism, or the free market economy, entrepreneurial class has emerged. So its relevance still confined to the university I come from, JNU, nowhere else. So, but then at the same time, let me tell you, demolishing the idols, the statues, doesn't extinguish the idea. Ideas remains. It depends how you're going to interpret these ideas, and you have to highlight its relevance. My only, in this context of his lecture today, because he talks about a lot of things, deconstruction, reconstruction, but then we have to go beyond it. If they're attempted to reconstructing, what are the attempted at, if they're attempted reconstructing the institutionalized narrative? So what are the attempted reconstructing it? What is coming up in the place where the narrative is deconstructed? And how relevant that narrative is? And is it a culturally defined Russian nation? Yes, you mentioned about its baleful implications, risky implication in terms of destabilization, in terms of its fragmentation is fine. But then there are attempts. How have they been successful? What are the challenges ahead? If there is a religious revivalism, because it's a global phenomenon, somebody called it a new religious movement or religion nationalism. So because the base of nationalism is changing, it's not confined to India alone, everywhere else. And if it is happening so, what are the external factors? I think you forgot to mention about the Balkan War. Yes? And look at the Chechenian incident or the Chechenian insurgency, militancy, has much to do with the global Islamist terror, which had its base in Afghanistan. So, third is the way European Union has been expanding, largely based on this shared identity. So, how do you locate Russia, for example, in terms of its cultural uniqueness? Then you have very rightly underlined the three major streams, the Byzantinian streams, the ethnic streams, and the so-called quote-unquote progressive represented by the communists, Stalin, Lenin, and all that. But which stream is dominant? And which influence is quite manifest in terms of policy shaping and in terms of acceptability among the people of Russia today? And lastly, you mentioned about three things. There's a competition among the state elites, the way it is being interpreted, the way it has been observed by the Russian scholars and watchers, that whether the Russian elite would opt for a developmental state like this South Korean model, or it would go for the Pinochet model, or what I call the West Asian model, Saddam Hussein model, or Mubarak model, like you have a kind of, what I call perfunctory election for the purpose of legitimation of your, hold on power, state power, or is it moving to the typical liberal democracy like us? So the three streams, please tell us which way Russia is moving. That's what I expected from you based on your research. Okay, you basically highlighted the challenges, you highlighted the problem, very rightly you have problematized the issue, but I was expecting some kind of causally linked argument pointing towards the trajectory, definite trajectory, so the Russian nation-building process in post-Soviet period is concerned. Thank you very much. I think you look into it. If you want to say, please briefly, you can say this. So
thank you so much for a very detailed critique and suggestions about my discussion today. And thanks a lot, Professor, for presiding it very adroitly. What I would just add on here as a small, I won't say it's a caveat, but just an addition to your remarks, is that your questions, and I would start with the last one, which is about the policies shaping which one of the narrative is dominating the space. Let me give you give it a try through one of the metaphors. When the Russian aeroplane goes to protect the Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, the priest of Russian Orthodox Church comes and sprinkles the holy water. Okay. On the 9th of May, when the Victory Day parade is celebrated, so the red flag and Orthodox Church emblems are co-joined in one single pole. History is confrontational most of the time, if at all they are on different sides of the narrative, if at all they have different ideologies. But it's the craftsmanship of a great state builder who wants to inculcate primarily irreconcilable looking agendas to bring under the overarching narrative. And that has been the case primarily, and why it has happened so because of, as Professor Mahapatra so rightly pointed out, the perennial, eternal expansion of the European Union as an Atlantist political project has created a certain level of consolidation of very different elements in Russia to find an all-inclusive identity of Russians who are trying to assert themselves through their Europhile expertise, through their Eurasian expertise, through their Byzantium characteristics. And this is, from the surface, looking very contrasting, irreconcilable. But it has a historical precedent that in most of the historical past of the 200 years when Russia as a state has been challenged either by the aggressor or by one different dominant political narrative, they try to pull up their resources, close their ranks, and try to protect and consolidate, hold the fort. So that hold the fort is one overarching identity that Russians do have, and at the same time to leapfrog their modernization and innovation policies. So this is not a state which has been in retreat, is in isolation, is engaged, and very interestingly, I was witnessing that most of those countries which have imposed sanctions on Russia, both in 2017 and 18, their bilateral trade has increased, including their investment in Russian Federation proper. And that says a lot about the hypocrisy of the Western sanction in Russia, as well as the limitation of that. That's one. The second part that was asked by Professor, who so rightly pointed out that can we really identify how basically this 1998, of course, this turning of the plane in mid-sky by Primakov, they call it Primakov's turn. So that has been, of course, a defining moment. But so is the defining moment of the Munich Security Conference speech of President Putin in 2007, when the unilateralism, monopolism of the planet has been questioned in a very eloquent academic way. And lastly, I would just try to sum it up from my side that the Russian state has an unprecedented challenge in its history, not only to consolidate and empower their citizens' capacity, but as well as to consolidate the statehood. And in the earlier times, it used to happen so that consolidation of the state used to happen at the cost of the consolidation or empowerment of its subjects. And in the empire building, that's how the narrative goes. The state has to become stronger, and then the subjects, okay, we will take care of them a little later at the time of the peace. In this present time, Russian state has been working back and forth on both issues in order to consolidate its external challenges as well as those fundamental issues that confronts Russia's demography, its citizens, be it health, be it education, be it innovation, so on and so forth. So we are living through very interesting times, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajhans. Thank you very much. On the whole, what I understand is the experiment of nation building in post-Soviet Russia is a kind of dialectical process. Don't look for the precedence of one over the other. So they influence each other and get influence as well. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you all.